Ellie Jackson, a dedicated janitor, thought it was just another ordinary day at work until everything changed in the most humiliating way possible. Publicly shamed by the hotel owner in front of her colleagues, she found herself at rock bottom. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, an unexpected guest stepped in and flipped the script, delivering justice in a way no one saw coming. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay tuned until the end to witness the shocking twist that transformed Ellie's life forever. And hey, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Ellie moved through the grand marble corridors of the Orchid Regency Hotel, her cleaning cart squeaking softly with each step. The hum of vacuum cleaners blended with the scent of fresh flowers and disinfectant, while sunlight streamed through the pristine windows, casting golden beams over the elegant decor. Everything in this place sparkled, except for the way Ellie felt inside. The weight of her daily grind pressed down on her shoulders as her worn hands gripped the cart with quiet strength. Every wrinkle on her face told a story of resilience, every streak of gray in her neatly tied headscarf a badge of years spent in thankless labor. Walking beside her was Clara, her younger colleague, whose bright energy added a little warmth to the hotel's cold, formal atmosphere. As they moved, Clara folded towels into neat squares, her blonde ponytail swinging with every step. "Did you hear about the big event today?" Clara asked, her voice light with curiosity. Ellie glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "What event?" "Some charity dinner," Clara explained. "They're calling it Dignity and Labor. Supposed to be about recognizing workers like us." Ellie let out a dry, knowing laugh. "Dignity and labor, huh? Sounds like another excuse for them to pat themselves on the back while we clean up after them." She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the plush carpet ahead. Clara sighed. "Maybe this time it'll be different. They say some big celebrity is supposed to be there." Ellie smirked. "Big celebrities don't care about people like us. They care about their image, their cameras, and their applause. We're just part of the background." Clara didn't argue. She knew Ellie was right. The two women continued their work in silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick red carpet. Their next stop, the presidential suite at the end of the hall, one of the most expensive rooms in the hotel, reserved for high-profile guests. Ellie swiped the key card and pushed open the door, only to be hit with the overwhelming stench of alcohol and smoke. "Oh wow," Clara muttered, covering her nose with her sleeve. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. "Looks like somebody had a wild night." Ellie's sharp gaze swept the room. It was a disaster zone. Confetti littered the floor like a hurricane had ripped through the space. Empty champagne bottles sat on every surface, pizza boxes and half-eaten food lay strewn across the coffee table, crumbs ground into the luxurious white carpet. "Unbelievable," Ellie muttered as she wheeled her cart inside, her expression unreadable. She surveyed the mess like a soldier assessing a battlefield. "This is gonna take hours." Clara let out a slow whistle. "VIP treatment, I guess," she said, shaking her head. "Whoever stayed here must think they're royalty." Ellie snorted. "Royalty wouldn't leave a mess like this. This is the kind of disaster spoiled kids make." They got to work, falling into the familiar rhythm of cleaning up chaos. Ellie focused on the bedroom while Clara tackled the kitchen. Sheets lay tangled on the bed, discarded clothes were scattered across the floor. Ellie methodically stripped the linens, tossing them into the laundry bag, her muscles aching with each pull, but she didn't stop. This was normal. This was her job. This was her life. Then, suddenly, the door swung open with a loud bang. Clara flinched. Ellie turned slowly to see Richard Hensley, the hotel's owner, striding in with sharp, deliberate steps. His expensive suit was impeccable, his tie perfectly straight, his shoes gleaming like polished mirrors. His lip curled in disgust as he took in the mess. "Is this what you call cleaning?" His voice sliced through the air like broken glass. Ellie straightened her back but didn't respond. She kept her hands on the sheet she was folding, her focus steady. Don't you hear me, Jackson? Hensley's voice boomed, his eyes narrowing. I asked you a question. Ellie kept her gaze down, her tone calm. We just started cleaning, Mr. Hensley. This is how it was when we got here. Excuses, he sneered, stepping closer. I'm tired of hearing your excuses. Every day it's the same thing with you, slow, sloppy, useless. His eyes flicked toward Clara, softening just slightly. Unlike Miss Mitchell here. At least she knows how to act like a professional. Clara's eyes widened. She quickly shook her head. Sir, Ellie works harder than anyone else here. She just needs a little more time. Silence. And that's when everything changed. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you stunned. The whirlwind of emotions churning inside her. Cena nodded slightly, his sharp eyes never leaving hers. I saw what happened upstairs, he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. That was some real low-life behavior. Ellie's jaw tightened, her grip on the cleaning cart turning her knuckles white. It is what it is, she muttered, trying to push down the burning anger still simmering in her chest. She wasn't looking for sympathy, and she sure as hell didn't expect a celebrity like John Cena to care. But Cena took a step closer, his presence filling the narrow corridor. Nah, he said firmly, shaking his head. That's not how this works. You don't just get to be treated like dirt and shrug it off like it's normal. His voice lowered, steady and unshakable. You deserve better than that. Ellie let out a sharp breath, the words hitting a nerve she hadn't realized was still raw. She'd spent years swallowing her pride, brushing off mistreatment like it was just part of the job. But now, standing face to face with someone who actually saw her, really saw her, something inside her cracked. She met his gaze, her voice quiet but firm. And what am I supposed to do about it? Cena folded his arms, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Funny you should ask. Clara, still standing a few steps behind, let out a small gasp, her hands covering her mouth as she looked between them. Wait, what do you mean? Cena glanced at her, then back at Ellie, his smirk fading into something more serious. Let's just say I have a few connections. And I don't take kindly to bullies. Ellie's heart pounded. Was he actually offering to help? Was this real? She wanted to believe it, but years of experience told her not to get her hopes up. Cena must have seen the doubt flicker in her eyes because he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a quiet promise. Trust me, Ellie. By the time I'm done, Hensley's gonna wish he never crossed you. Ellie stared at him, her breath caught between disbelief and something that felt dangerously close to hope. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Ellie Jackson stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom, the weight of 1,000 silent years pressing against her chest. But this time, she didn't bow under it. This time, she stepped forward. The glittering chandeliers above cast shimmering reflections on the polished marble floors, illuminating the faces of the city's wealthiest elites as they sipped champagne and exchanged empty pleasantries. A string quartet played softly in the background, their music as polished and controlled as the carefully curated smiles of the guests. At the front of the room, the stage stood ready, a sleek podium positioned beneath a massive banner that read, "Celebrating those who keep us moving." Ellie almost laughed at the irony. These people had no idea what it meant to keep moving. They had never scrubbed their dignity off the floor with bleach and calloused hands, never swallowed their pride along with the stale air of a forgotten basement shift. But tonight, that was about to change. Cena walked beside her, his presence steady, unwavering. He didn't need to say anything, his belief in her was loud enough without words. Clara, just a step behind, watched with wide, nervous eyes. Hushed whispers began rippling through the crowd as Ellie stepped further into the room, her still damp uniform stark against the sea of designer gowns and tuxedos. Richard Hensley, standing near the stage, froze mid-conversation, his expression twisting from surprise to barely concealed irritation. Ellie met his gaze head-on. A hush spread over the ballroom, champagne glasses pausing mid-air, conversations tapering off as people turned toward the unexpected disruption. Cena leaned in slightly, his voice low but sure. "Whenever you're ready." Ellie inhaled deeply, her fingers tightening around the edges of her damp sleeves. Then she stepped onto the stage. Hensley's voice cut through the silence, sharp and dripping with forced politeness. "Miss Jackson, this is hardly the time or place." "It's exactly the time and place," Ellie interrupted, her voice clear, steady, stronger than even she expected. She turned to the crowd, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. "You're here tonight to celebrate workers like me. But do you really see us?" Murmurs swept through the crowd. Hensley took a step forward, his jaw tightening. "Ellie, I think you're confused." "No, Mr. Hensley," she said, meeting his gaze without fear. "For the first time in a long time, I'm not." She turned back to the room. "Let me tell you what dignity in labor really looks like." And with John Cena standing silently beside her, Ellie Jackson, once invisible, began to speak. Not a single person in that ballroom would ever forget what she had to say. Ellie Jackson stepped onto the stage, the weight of a decade's worth of silent labor pressing against her, but she didn't let it crush her, not tonight. The ballroom was dead silent, the only sound the faint clinking of glasses as a few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard Hensley's expression was frozen between forced composure and barely concealed panic. He adjusted his suit jacket as if that would help him regain control of the moment, but there was no mistaking it. This was slipping through his fingers. Ellie reached the microphone, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of the podium. She exhaled, steadying herself. She wasn't a public speaker. She wasn't rich or powerful. But she was here, and for the first time, they were all looking at her. She met the crowd's expectant stares, then glanced at Cena, who gave her a slight nod. No pressure, just belief. Ellie inhaled again, deeper this time, and spoke. "You don't know me," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves tightening in her chest. "You've probably never noticed me, even if I've been in the same room as you 100 times. But I know you. I know what kind of coffee you like, what time you usually wake up, whether you leave your towels on the floor or hang them up. I know how to get wine stains out of $1,000 carpets, how to make a bed so perfectly it looks like no one ever touched it." She let her gaze sweep over the audience. "I know because that's been my job for 10 years. 10 years of cleaning up after you. 10 years of being invisible." A few guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. Others leaned forward, fully drawn in. Ellie turned her head toward Hensley now, looking him dead in the eye. "And today, for doing that job, I was humiliated." A hush spread through the crowd like a shockwave. The same man who's hosting this event, this celebration of dignity and labor, poured dirty mop water on me like I was nothing. Gasps rippled through the room. Hensley's face darkened, but he stayed silent, his jaw tight, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. Ellie turned back to the audience. "And the worst part? I almost accepted it. I almost let it happen because that's what we do, right? We keep our heads down, we take it, we move on." She swallowed hard, the years of swallowed pride clawing at her throat. "But not tonight." She glanced at Cena, then back at the crowd. "Tonight, I'm asking you to see us. To see the people who keep this place running, who work through the night while you sleep in clean sheets, who make sure your luxury feels effortless." Her voice didn't shake now, it only grew stronger. "Dignity isn't something you hand out in speeches and charity dinners. It's how you treat people when no one's watching." Silence. A thick, deafening silence. Then, applause. It started slow, hesitant, like people weren't sure if they should. But then it grew, stronger, louder, rolling through the ballroom like a wave. Some guests stood, clapping harder, others whispering among themselves, glancing at Hensley with barely concealed disdain. Hensley's face was red now, his polished composure cracked down the middle. Cena leaned toward the microphone, his voice steady, unshakable. "So, Richard," he said, a smirk playing at his lips. What do you have to say about dignity and labor now? Hensley opened his mouth, but no words came out. Ellie watched him, her heart pounding, but it wasn't fear this time. It was something else. Power. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't invisible. Not anymore. Them? How many times have you stayed in hotels like this, enjoyed the spotless rooms, the folded towels, the perfectly set tables, without ever thinking about the people who made it that way? Ellie let her words settle, let them sink into the uncomfortable silence that now filled the grand ballroom. She could see it on their faces, the realization, the quiet guilt. Some guests looked down, avoiding her gaze. Others stared at her with something close to admiration. We are not background noise, she continued, her voice unwavering. We are not furniture. We are people. We have families, we have dreams, and we deserve respect. She turned toward Richard Hensley once more, her chin lifting slightly. And you, she said, her voice sharp and clear, you don't get to talk about dignity while treating the people beneath you like trash. A hush fell over the room. Hensley's jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. His once pristine confidence had crumbled, leaving behind nothing but a man exposed for what he truly was. Then, from the back of the room, the sound of slow, deliberate applause cut through the silence. John Cena. He clapped, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked on Ellie with something that looked an awful lot like respect. And then, one by one, others joined in. A few hesitant claps at first, then more, until the entire room was filled with applause, loud, unwavering, undeniable. Ellie felt her breath hitch in her throat. She had spent so long being overlooked, so long blending into the walls of this hotel, so long believing that people like her weren't meant to be seen. But tonight, they saw her. Not as a housekeeper. Not as someone to ignore. They saw her as Ellie Jackson, a woman who refused to be invisible. And she wasn't done yet. Froze, his breath hitching in his throat as John Cena took another step forward, towering over him. The tension in the room was thick, a silent energy crackling between them. The guests held their breath, waiting. Cena didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You want to talk about power? He said, his voice steady, controlled. Power isn't yelling the loudest. It's not threatening people who've already proven they don't fear you. Hensley clenched his fists, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an ally, a way out. But there was none. The people who once laughed at his jokes and shook his hand now looked away, embarrassed to have ever stood beside him. Cena took another step forward, closing the distance until there was nowhere for Hensley to go. Power isn't in a paycheck. It's in respect. And from where I'm standing, you got none left. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Hensley staggered back, his face twisted in fury and desperation. I built this place, he spat, his voice cracking. You can't take that away from me. Ellie, still standing on the stage, finally spoke. You built it on the backs of people like me. The room was silent again. This time, it wasn't the hush of uncertainty, it was finality. Cena tilted his head slightly. You're done, Hensley. Hensley let out a choked, bitter laugh, shaking his head wildly. You think the board will fire me? I own this place. Not anymore. A new voice rang out, cutting through the room like a blade. All eyes turned toward the back of the ballroom, where a group of sharply dressed individuals stood, members of the hotel's board of directors. One of them, an older man with silver hair and an expression carved from stone, stepped forward. Richard, he said, his voice laced with quiet authority. You've embarrassed this establishment for the last time. Hensley's face paled. W. Watt? Another board member spoke up. We've already begun drafting the paperwork. Effective immediately, your position as owner and manager of the Orchid Regency is revoked. Gasps spread through the crowd. Hensley's mouth opened and closed, searching for words, but nothing came out. Ellie felt her heart race, disbelief and vindication mixing in her chest. Could this really be happening? The silver-haired board member turned to Ellie, his gaze softening. "Miss Jackson, if you'll allow us, we'd like to formally apologize for everything you've endured under his leadership." Ellie blinked, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But before she could respond, the board member continued. "And we'd also like to offer you a promotion." The room stirred again, the whispers growing louder. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. "We need someone who truly understands the meaning of dignity and labor. Someone who respects the people who make this hotel run. We'd like you to step into a leadership role, head of housekeeping, with full authority over staff treatment, wages, and policies." Ellie's lips parted slightly. This was something she had never even imagined. She turned to Clara, who was nearly in tears, nodding eagerly. She turned to Cena, who simply gave her that small, knowing smirk. "Told you things could change." Ellie looked out over the crowd, at the faces that had once ignored her but now saw her for who she was. And then, slowly, she turned back to the board and nodded. "I accept." The room erupted into cheers. Richard Hensley, pale and defeated, stumbled backward. "You can't do this. I built this place." Cena exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Then you should have treated the people who keep it running with some damn respect." Two security guards stepped forward, ready to escort Hensley out. But he didn't fight. He just stood there, staring at the life he once controlled as it slipped through his fingers. And then, with one final glare at Ellie, he turned and walked out. The doors shut behind him. Ellie Jackson stood at the center of the ballroom, the weight that had been on her shoulders for years finally lifting. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen. She was heard. And she had won. "Thought it would happen to him," Clara giggled, shaking her head. "He really thought he was invincible." Ellie exhaled deeply, a slow smile creeping onto her lips. "They always do," she murmured. Behind them, John Cena stood with his arms crossed, watching the last of the guests disappear back into the ballroom. The cameras had stopped recording, the chaos was settling, but the moment would live on forever. He turned back to Ellie, his expression softer now. "You good?" Ellie met his gaze, nodding. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady. "For the first time in a long time, I really am." Cena gave her a small nod of approval. "Good. Because this?" He gestured vaguely toward the dumpster with a smirk. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person like him who thinks they can get away with treating people like garbage. Ellie took a deep breath, letting the night air fill her lungs. "Yeah," she agreed. "But tonight, they all learned, people like me, we're not invisible anymore." Clara beamed, linking her arm with Ellie's. "So, does this mean you're going to take the promotion?" Ellie hesitated, but only for a second. Then she straightened her shoulders, a newfound confidence settling into her bones. "Damn right I am." Cena chuckled. "That's what I like to hear." The three of them stood there for a moment, the night stretching out before them like an open road. Inside, the city's elite were still trying to make sense of what had happened. Outside, a chapter had closed, and a new one had begun. Ellie Jackson had walked into the Orchid Regency as just another housekeeper. She was walking out as something else entirely. A woman who refused to be ignored. A woman who had won. Did you see that coming? Sometimes, justice has a way of finding people when they least expect it. For years, Ellie Jackson was just another face in the background, a worker who kept things running but was never truly seen. She scrubbed floors, cleaned rooms, and carried the weight of a job that most people never thought twice about. She was invisible until the day she refused to be. Humiliated in front of her colleagues, disrespected by the very man who was supposed to uphold the values of dignity and labor, Ellie had every reason to stay silent, to keep her head down like she had for years. But she didn't. She stood her ground. And in doing so, she didn't just fight for herself, she stood up for every worker who had ever been overlooked, for everyone who had been told they didn't matter. And she won. With the support of those who believed in her, and with an unexpected ally by her side, Ellie took back her dignity and changed the game. The man who thought he was untouchable, the one who used his power to humiliate others, was finally held accountable. And Ellie? She walked away stronger than ever, proving that the people who work behind the scenes are the ones who truly keep the world moving. But now, let's turn the question to you. What would you have done in her place? Would you have stayed silent, hoping things would eventually change? Or would you have taken a stand, knowing that justice sometimes needs a push? Let us know in the comments. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more powerful stories that remind the world why dignity matters. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And until next time, remember, the people who are overlooked today might just be the ones who change everything tomorrow. We'll see you in the next one.